In 1944, at the Bretton Woods Conference, the United States dollar became the world's reserve currency. This was, by any measure, the ultimate stamp of economic dominance. Every country on Earth would hold dollars. Every major commodity would be priced in dollars. Global trade would flow through dollars. Here's what's interesting. In 1944, Britain's pound sterling had been the world's reserve currency for over a century. And the people setting up the dollar system, American and British officials sitting in that New Hampshire hotel, they could literally look at the financial records showing how Britain's reserve currency status had contributed to its economic decline. They had the autopsy report. They knew exactly what had killed the previous reserve currency, and they set up the exact same system anyway. So what is going on here? Why does every reserve currency seem to follow the same pattern of rise, dominance, and eventual collapse? We're going to dig into 4 key questions. First, what even is a reserve currency, and why does it matter? Second, what's the actual mechanism that turns reserve currency status from an advantage into a death sentence? Third, what does the archaeological record tell us about how long reserve currencies last? And fourth, what does this pattern mean for the dollar right now? Let's excavate the historical record. Cool. So, a reserve currency is money that other countries hold in significant quantities and use for international transactions. If you're France and you want to buy oil from Saudi Arabia, you probably need dollars to do it. The dollar is the intermediary. And this is incredibly powerful. When your currency is the reserve currency, you have what economists call exorbitant privilege. You can borrow more cheaply than anyone else because there's always demand for your currency. You can run trade deficits indefinitely because other countries need to accumulate your currency. You can print money without immediate inflationary consequences because that money gets absorbed by global demand. The Roman denarius was the reserve currency of the Mediterranean world for centuries. The Spanish silver real became the first truly global reserve currency in the 1500s. The Dutch guilder took over in the 1600s. The British pound sterling dominated the 1800s and early 1900s. And the dollar has held the position since 1944. Here's the thing that makes this fascinating. We have financial records from all of these currencies. And when you excavate that data, you find the same pattern over and over again. Reserve currency status lasts somewhere between 80 and 100 years on average, and the decline follows a remarkably similar trajectory each time. Which raises an uncomfortable question. The dollar has been the reserve currency for 80 years now. We're right at the historical average lifespan. The denarius became the dominant currency of the Mediterranean around 200 BC. Roman military conquest meant Roman money flowed everywhere. If you were doing international trade anywhere in the Mediterranean or Near East, you were probably using denarii. This worked brilliantly for Rome. They could finance military expansion by minting currency that other people accepted as valuable. They could import goods without worrying about trade balances because everyone wanted denarii. But Rome began to abuse that privilege. Under Emperor Nero in 64 AD, the silver content in the denarius was reduced from 99.5% to about 93.5%. Over the next 200 years, the debasement accelerated. By 235 AD, the denarius was about 50% silver. By 270 AD, about 5%. By the early 300s, basically bronze with a silver wash. Why? Rome was spending more than it was taking in, primarily on the military. And they financed that deficit by debasing the currency. Since everyone needed denarii for trade, Rome could get away with this for a while. The global demand absorbed the inflation, but eventually, reality caught up. By the late 200s, people started refusing denarii for major transactions. Archaeologist Kevin Butcher has documented how people in the eastern provinces reverted to using old, high silver content denarii from a century earlier, or switched to local currencies, or just used barter. Diocletian tried to fix this in 301 AD with his price edict, wage and price controls enforced by death penalty. It didn't work. By the mid-300s, Rome had to completely replace the denarius with a new currency system. The old reserve currency was dead. The key point, the denarius didn't collapse. because Rome was invaded. Rome was still the dominant military power when the currency collapsed. The currency collapsed because Rome had spent decades exploiting its reserve currency status to finance expenditures it couldn't actually afford. The Spanish silver real became the world's first truly global reserve currency in the 1500s. Spanish silver coins were used everywhere: Europe, Ming China, the Ottoman Empire, India, across the Americas. Spain controlled somewhere between 60–80% of global silver production. The real was literally the world's money. So why did Spain go bankrupt 9 times between 1557 and 1696? The pattern is identical to Rome. Spain used its reserve currency status to borrow extensively. Because the real was the global currency, credit was cheap. Everyone wanted to lend to Spain because loans were denominated in the most reliable currency in the world. Spain borrowed to fund military campaigns across Europe. And because borrowing was easy, Spain kept spending beyond its productive capacity. Historian Mauricio Glichman's excavation of Spanish fiscal records shows that by the 1590s, about 40% of government revenue went just to debt service, not military spending itself, just paying interest on previous borrowing. The reserve currency status made this worse. Spain could keep borrowing even when over-leveraged because creditors needed reals for international trade anyway. But eventually, creditors started demanding higher interest rates. Spanish rates climbed from about 5% in the mid-1500s to over 20% by the 1640s. At that point, default was inevitable. Each Spanish bankruptcy damaged confidence in the real as a reserve currency. By 1700, Spain was no longer the dominant economy, and the real was no longer the unquestioned global reserve currency. Now Britain, because this is the example that American officials at Bretton Woods actually had in front of them. They could see the whole arc. They knew what happened. The pound sterling became the dominant global reserve currency in the 1800s. Britain ran persistent trade deficits during much of this period, but when you're the reserve currency, that's not necessarily a problem. Other countries need pounds for trade, so they're happy to sell you stuff and take pounds in return. Then came the World Wars. World War I cost Britain about 5 to 6 times pre-war GDP. World War II added more. Britain borrowed extensively, and because the pound was the reserve currency, borrowing was relatively easy. Britain won both wars decisively, and it destroyed their reserve currency status anyway. By 1945, Britain owed so much money that the country required emergency loans from the US just to avoid immediate default. The 1946 loan came with conditions. Britain had to make the pound convertible and dismantle the trade preferences holding the empire together. In 1947, Britain tried to make the pound convertible. Within 6 weeks, there was a run on the pound so severe that Britain had to suspend convertibility. The market had voted. The pound was no longer trusted. In 1967, Britain devalued the pound by 14% against the dollar. In 1976, Britain required an IMF bailout. By the 1980s, the pound's share of global reserves had dropped from over 50% in 1950 to less than 5%. What's instructive? This happened despite Britain remaining a democracy, maintaining rule of law, and avoiding major wars after 1945, Britain did everything right in terms of economic management. The pound still lost reserve status. Why? Because Britain had used reserve currency status to borrow beyond its productive capacity to finance military expenditures. And once that borrowing capacity was exhausted, there was no way to maintain the currency's dominance. Let's look at the actual mechanism. Economist Barry Eichengreen calls this the exorbitant privileges exorbitant burden. Here's how it works. Stage 1. Your country becomes economically dominant through productive superiority. The economic dominance is real and earned. Stage 2. Economic dominance leads to currency dominance. People want your currency because your economy produces things they want to buy. Stage 3. Reserve currency status creates borrowing capacity. Because other countries need your currency for trade, they're willing to lend. Your borrowing costs drop. Stage 4. Cheap borrowing enables behavior that undermines productive capacity. You can run deficits indefinitely. Historically, those deficits have gone primarily to military spending and consumption rather than productive investment. Stage 5. The deficits persist until the gap between borrowing and productive capacity becomes structural. You're not borrowing for emergencies. Borrowing becomes how your economy works permanently. Stage 6. Eventually, creditors start to worry. At some point, people ask, can they actually pay this back? Once that question is asked seriously, the answer is usually no. Stage 7. Loss of confidence accelerates. Currency crises are self-fulfilling. If people think your currency will lose value, they sell it, which causes it to lose value, which causes more people to sell. The brutal truth, once you're in stage 6 or 7, there's no good solution. The productive capacity that originally justified reserve currency status has been eroded by decades of borrowing-enabled consumption and military spending. Alright, so this is where everyone gets angry. Please like the video before the comments. The dollar became the global reserve currency in 1944. That's 80 years ago. The average lifespan of a reserve currency is 100 years. We're entering the danger zone, but timelines aren't destiny. Let's look at where the dollar is in the mechanism. Stages 1 and 2. Clearly completed. The U.S. had genuine productive dominance after World War II, and the dollar became the reserve currency as a result. Stage 3. Absolutely yes. U.S. borrowing costs are lower than virtually any other country because of dollar reserve status. Stage 4. Has the U.S. used cheap borrowing to finance expenditures that undermine productive capacity? Since 1970, the U.S. has run consistent trade deficits financed by dollar reserve status. Total federal debt is now over 120% of GDP. Defense spending over the past 20 years has added trillions to that debt. Meanwhile, U.S. productive capacity as a share of global GDP has declined from about 40% in 1960 to about 25% today. So yeah, there's evidence of Stage 4 behavior. Stage 5, the Congressional Budget Office projects that without policy changes, U.S. federal deficits will persist indefinitely. The trade deficit has been continuous for over 30 years. This seems structural. Stage 6. Are creditors getting worried? So far, mostly no. Treasury yields remain relatively low, but the dollar's share of global reserves has declined from about 70% in 2000 to about 58% today, which is notable. We haven't seen the confidence crisis that preceded the collapse of previous reserve currencies. The dollar is still by far the dominant reserve currency. Here's what makes the dollar's situation potentially different. There's no obvious successor. When the pound declined, the dollar was ready. When previous currencies faded, alternatives existed. Right now, what's the alternative? The euro? Structural problems. No unified fiscal policy. The sovereign debt crisis of 2010-2012 revealed the fragility. The euro is about 20% of global reserves. The yuan? China's capital controls make it unusable for many transactions. Chinese financial markets aren't open enough. The yuan is less than 3% of global reserves. Gold? Can't scale. Global trade is trillions per day. There's not enough gold. So we're in this weird situation where the dollar shows many warning signs from previous reserve currency declines, but there's no clear alternative. What if this time, when the reserve currency fails, there's no successor? That's never happened in recorded history, but the pattern has to break eventually, right? Let me be clear. I'm not predicting the dollar will collapse next year or even next decade. The timeline for these things is long and uncertain. Britain remained a major power for decades after the pound lost reserve status. What I am saying is that the historical pattern is the pattern. Reserve currency status lasts 100 years on average. The dollar is at 80 years. Reserve currency status creates the capacity for borrowing beyond productive means. The U.S. has been doing this for decades. Reserve currency status ends when confidence erodes, often suddenly after a long period of stability. These are facts from the archaeological record. Whether they apply to the dollar specifically, and whether the timeline is 5 years or 50 years is unknowable. Here's the important takeaway. Reserve currency status is not permanent. It's a phase in the cycle of economic power. It comes with enormous advantages: cheap borrowing, global influence, financial flexibility, but it also comes with enormous temptations to borrow too much, to spend on non-productive activities. And historically, every single reserve currency has eventually succumbed to those temptations. Rome debased the denarius. Spain borrowed itself into repeated bankruptcies. Britain exhausted itself fighting necessary wars. The question isn't whether the pattern will continue. The question is whether anyone can actually learn from history and do something different, or whether the structural forces that drive reserve currencies to self-destruct are just too powerful to resist. Diocletian tried to fix the denarius with price controls. It didn't work. Spanish kings tried to reform taxation. It didn't work. British policymakers tried to maintain the pound while rebuilding the economy. It didn't work. Maybe the US can be different. Maybe modern monetary policy tools or global financial integration changes the game in some fundamental way. Or maybe we're just watching the same movie play out again with different actors, and the dollar's decline is as inevitable as every reserve currency that came before it. The archaeological evidence is pretty clear. Reserve currencies are not permanent. They're a phase that corresponds to productive economic dominance, and when that dominance fades, the reserve currency status fades with it. Every empire that's achieved reserve currency status has eventually lost it. Every single one. Most of them saw it coming and tried to prevent it and failed anyway. Check back in 50 years and we'll see if the pattern held. If you found this interesting, or if you think I've completely misread the historical data, please like the video and consider subscribing. If there's a reserve currency collapse I missed, or a mechanism I got wrong, leave a comment. Thanks for watching.